Jordan Cole, a police captain, adjusted the strap of his grocery bag as he casually walked through the aisles of a chain store. It was one of those rare afternoons where he wasn't in uniform, not dealing with stressful situations or tight deadlines, a rare day off. He blended in with the other shoppers, just another person picking up essentials. Near the toiletries aisle, Jordan noticed a man standing impatiently by a locked glass case. At first, he ignored him, but the man's voice grew louder, drawing Jordan into the situation. "Unbelievable," the man muttered irritably. "I have to wait here because of them." Jordan slowed his pace, glancing at the man, whose face was flushed with frustration. The young store clerk, a woman in her 20s, unlocked the case without making eye contact. "Ridiculous," the man added louder. "It's because of black people. They're the ones stealing everything, and now I have to wait every time." Jordan stopped, noticing the clerk's hands trembling as she handed the man his item. The man continued ranting. "New York City's gone to trash. You can see them eyeing things that don't belong to them on every street." Jordan felt a familiar anger rising in him, the kind he had long learned to control. He was off duty, just a shopper like anyone else, but he couldn't ignore the man's racist tirade. He approached, his voice calm but firm. "Why don't you repeat that for everyone to hear?" The man, Troy Walters, startled by Jordan's interruption, looked him up and down, dismissing him as just another person trying to be a hero. "Oh, you got something to say?" Troy sneered. "Figures." "Yeah, I do," Jordan replied, gesturing toward the clerk. "What gives you the right to talk to people like that, blaming her for your problems when you don't even know what you're talking about?" Troy's sneer deepened. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you don't like hearing the truth, huh?" Jordan stepped closer, his voice low but powerful enough to silence the area around them. "You don't know the first thing about the truth." Troy's arrogance only grew. He puffed out his chest, giving Jordan a once-over. "Oh, I know enough," he said, turning to the small crowd of onlookers. "You people are all the same, always playing the victim, always someone else's fault." Jordan's fists clenched, though he kept his face calm. He had a choice now: escalate or educate. "You think your life's hard because of people like me?" Jordan asked, his voice steady. "You're upset about waiting a few minutes for someone to unlock a cabinet, and that's our fault?" Troy scoffed. "It's more than that. I'm sick of how this city caters to you." He hesitated, eyeing Jordan, searching for words that wouldn't land him in deeper trouble. But his pause made it clear what he meant. Jordan crossed his arms, keeping his gaze on Troy. "Go ahead, say it. I'm sure you've got plenty more to get off your chest." The store clerk stood frozen near the display, her discomfort obvious. Jordan gave her a reassuring nod, silently telling her he had things under control. Troy took the bait, his voice louder now. "You know what the problem is? We're bending over backward for people who don't deserve it. People like you," he pointed at Jordan, "expect everything to be handed to you. Special treatment for everyone but us, right? I'm sick of it." Jordan stayed calm. "People like me?" he asked, his voice cool. "You mean people who don't look like you?" Troy's smirk faltered briefly, but he doubled down. "Yeah, exactly. I shouldn't have to suffer because others can't follow the rules." "Suffer?" Jordan stepped closer. "You call waiting an extra minute suffering?" Troy didn't answer, but his sneer said enough. He glanced at the growing crowd, clearly hoping for some support. Jordan's voice dropped barely above a whisper, but still commanding. "You know what real suffering is? It's being judged the moment you walk into a room. It's people assuming the worst of you because of your skin color. It's hearing ignorant comments like yours and being expected to just let it slide." Troy chuckled, shaking his head. "Here we go, playing the race card, right on schedule. You don't get it, do you?" Jordan said, his voice steady. "This isn't about a card. It's about respect, the kind you think you're owed but don't know how to give." Troy's face flushed red, his hands clenching into fists. Jordan saw the flicker of violence in Troy's eyes, his body tense like he was ready to strike. But Jordan didn't flinch, holding his ground, daring Troy to make a move. The crowd around them had grown, with people recording on their phones. Troy hesitated, realizing that any physical aggression would only backfire on him. His anger simmered, but he swallowed it down. "You'll regret this," Troy spat before storming out of the store. Jordan watched him go, the tension in his chest easing slightly. He turned to the store clerk. "You all right?" he asked gently. She nodded quickly. I didn't know what to say. I'm sorry." "You don't have to apologize for him," Jordan said, his tone softening. "Just take care of yourself." Jordan headed to the checkout, thinking the situation was over. But as he stepped outside into the brisk air, he felt a hard shove from behind. He stumbled and turned to see Troy, his face twisted with rage. "You thought you could just walk away?" Troy sneered, puffing out his chest. "You don't get to walk away from me." Jordan squared his shoulders, his eyes locking on Troy. He could feel the situation spiraling out of control. "Walk away, man. It's over." Troy grinned, his anger fueling his arrogance. "Oh no, it's not over. You think you can make a fool of me in front of everyone?" Jordan stayed calm. "I'm not looking for trouble, but if you push it, you'll find it." That only made Troy more aggressive. He jabbed a finger into Jordan's chest. "Oh yeah. What are you going to do about it?" Jordan swatted Troy's hand away, his voice sharp. "Get your hands off me." Troy stumbled back, dramatically clutching his chest like he'd been hit. "That's it," he shouted, loud enough for bystanders to hear. "You just assaulted me." Jordan's eyes narrowed, but he kept his composure. He had seen this kind of manipulation before. Someone playing the victim after being in the wrong. Troy grabbed his phone, his hands shaking with fake outrage. "I'm calling the cops," he said, dialing 911. "I've just been assaulted by a black man outside the store. He attacked me for no reason." Jordan stood his ground, knowing where this was heading. Troy was banking on racial stereotypes to play the victim. But Troy had no idea who he was dealing with. As Troy finished his call, sirens began to approach in the distance. Troy's smirk widened, convinced his plan was working. But Jordan remained calm, knowing that when the police arrived, Troy's world was about to be turned upside down. Minutes later, the wail of sirens grew louder as the squad car pulled up to the curb. Troy stepped back, his arms spread wide like a performer awaiting applause, his smirk full of confidence as if his victory was moments away. "Officers, over here," Troy shouted, waving them over with exaggerated energy. "That's him. That's the guy who assaulted me." Two officers stepped out of the car. Officer Davis, young and fresh-faced, approached first with a clipboard in hand, while Officer Cruz, older and more experienced, hung back, observing the scene cautiously. "What seems to be the problem here, sir?" Officer Davis asked, his voice steady. Troy wasted no time, dramatically pointing at Jordan. "This guy hit me. I was just walking, minding my own business, and he hit me. I want him arrested right now." Jordan stood quietly, his arms relaxed at his sides, staying calm. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to twist a situation to their advantage. Before Officer Davis could respond, Officer Cruz stepped forward, his expression changing as he recognized Jordan. "Wait, Captain Cole?" Davis blinked in confusion, glancing between Jordan and Cruz. "Captain?" Troy's smug expression faltered for the first time, his eyes darting between Jordan and the officers. "Wait, what? He's a cop?" Jordan nodded, his tone measured. "That's right." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Troy's confidence wavered, but he was not ready to back down just yet. "I don't care if he's the mayor." Troy's voice rose in desperation. "He assaulted me, and I'm pressing charges. You need to arrest him." Officer Cruz narrowed his eyes slightly, his tone firm. "Sir, I suggest you calm down." "Calm down?" Troy's voice cracked with disbelief. "I'm the victim here. He hit me, and you're telling me to calm down?" Cruz stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Sir, lower your voice and step back." But Troy was not done. His face turned red with rage, and in one swift motion, he stepped toward Jordan again, jabbing his finger hard into Jordan's chest. "You think you can get away with this because you're a cop? You think you're better than me?" Jordan did not react, his eyes fixed on Troy, but Cruz moved immediately, grabbing Troy's arm before he could jab again. "That's enough," Cruz barked, his voice sharp. "Put your hands behind your back." Troy struggled, trying to pull free, but Cruz gave him no chance. "Wait, what? You're arresting me? For what?" "For assaulting an officer and refusing to comply with a lawful order," Cruz said, pulling out his handcuffs. Troy's face drained of color. No, you've got this all wrong. He's the one who hit me." Officer Davis moved in to assist, and together they turned Troy around, securing the cuffs on his wrists. Troy continued to sputter in disbelief. "This is insane. I didn't do anything wrong. You're arresting me. This can't be happening. Cruz tightened the cuffs, guiding Troy toward the squad car. You had your chance to walk away. Now you're being charged with assault and disorderly conduct. Troy's voice rose in a panicked shout. You can't do this. I'm the victim here. He assaulted me. You're arresting the wrong guy. Cruz opened the car door and shoved Troy inside as he continued to protest. You should have thought about that before you put your hands on him. Troy's protests were muffled as the car door slammed shut, leaving him confined to the back seat, his arrogance replaced by panic. Jordan finally let out a slow breath, the tension easing from his shoulders. Officer Davis turned to him, clearly shaken by the turn of events. Captain, are you all right? Davis asked, his voice uncertain. Jordan nodded, his voice calm and controlled. I'm fine, officer, thank you. Cruz walked back to Jordan, his expression respectful. Sorry about that, Captain. You know how these things go. Jordan gave a slight nod. It's fine. Just make sure he gets processed properly. Cruz glanced back at the squad car, where Troy sat in stunned silence, still trying to process how his plan had unraveled so quickly. We'll take care of him, Captain. Don't worry. The officers returned to the car, and as they drove away, Troy's angry shouts faded into the background noise of the busy city street. Jordan had dealt with men like Troy before and knew he would again. But for now, the situation had resolved itself. Jordan watched as the squad car disappeared into traffic, Troy's protests becoming faint echoes. The tension of the moment began to dissolve, replaced by the steady hum of the city resuming its normal rhythm. People who had stopped to watch the spectacle returned to their routines, the confrontation soon to be forgotten by everyone, except Jordan. Jordan stood still for a moment longer, replaying the scene in his mind. Troy's smug overconfidence, the way he had jabbed his finger into Jordan's chest like he owned the world, and the dramatic way he had tried to play the victim. It was typical behavior from people like Troy, who believed they could manipulate the system, twist the narrative, and escape without facing real consequences. But this time, Troy had been wrong. Jordan felt the weight of the situation settle over him. Instead of satisfaction, there was something else, unfinished business. Troy had crossed a line, not just with his physical aggression, but with his assumption that calling the police would automatically make Jordan the aggressor. He had tried to use the system as a weapon, a tool for his own entitlement. The arrest was just, but Jordan knew it wasn't enough. He started walking, his mind made up. He could go home, leave it at that, and move on with his day. But deep down, he knew he was not finished with Troy yet. This was more than just another hot-headed argument on a city street. Troy needed to understand the gravity of what he had done, and Jordan felt a responsibility to ensure that happened. Troy was not just a guy who had lost his temper. He was someone who believed he could wield power over Jordan because of who he was. Someone who thought the system would protect him. That was the part Jordan could not let slide. As he walked toward the precinct, his pace quickened. He had dealt with people like Troy his entire career. People who thought they could manipulate the police, twist the facts, and walk away without facing consequences. But Troy had run into the wrong person this time, and Jordan was going to make sure he understood that. The precinct loomed ahead, familiar and steady, a place where Jordan had handled countless situations like this. But this time was different. He was not just dealing with an entitled man who thought he could win by calling the cops. He was confronting a deeper issue. The entitlement Troy believed was his birthright. Jordan walked into the station, the noise of busy officers and ringing phones filling the air. At the front desk, an officer looked up, recognizing him instantly. Captain Cole, the officer greeted, surprise in his voice. You hear about Walters? Jordan nodded, his expression serious. I need to speak with him. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that. He's in holding. Caused a bit of a scene when we brought him in. You sure you want to deal with him? Jordan's voice was firm. I'm sure. I need to have a conversation with him. The officer hesitated before nodding and gesturing for Jordan to follow. As they walked toward the holding cells, Jordan's thoughts focused. This was not about gloating or rubbing Troy's face in the reality of his situation. It was about making sure Troy understood that actions had consequences, that people like him could not walk through life assuming they could bend the system to their will. They reached the holding area, and the officer gestured toward the far end of the row. "He's in the last cell," he said quietly. "I'll leave you to it." Jordan nodded his thanks and walked toward the cell where Troy sat on a bench, his hands resting on his knees, his head bowed. The cocky arrogance had drained from Troy's body, leaving only a man now trapped in the consequences of his actions. Jordan stopped just outside the bars, looking at Troy's slumped figure. He could still sense the tension simmering beneath the surface, the disbelief at how quickly Troy's narrative had crumbled. Troy had not noticed him yet, still lost in his own thoughts as the reality of the situation slowly sank in. Jordan stood there for a moment longer, letting the weight of the moment settle. He was not there to gloat or rub salt in the wound. He was there to ensure Troy understood that the world did not work the way he thought it did. With that, Jordan stepped forward, ready for the conversation. He knew it would not be easy, but it was necessary. Troy Walters was about to learn just how wrong he had been. Jordan stepped up to the bars, his eyes locking on Troy, who remained hunched over, stewing in frustration. The arrogance and swagger Troy had shown outside the store had evaporated, leaving a man grappling with a reality he had not anticipated. The sound of Jordan's footsteps finally caught Troy's attention. Troy lifted his head, his eyes narrowing as he saw Jordan standing there. For a moment, a flash of defiance crossed Troy's face, but it quickly faded, replaced by confusion and a flicker of fear. "What are you doing here?" Troy asked, his voice hoarse, the bravado gone. Jordan folded his arms, standing just outside the bars, his expression calm but firm. "I came to talk to you. You need to understand something." Troy's face twisted in anger and disbelief. "Understand what? You're here to rub it in? You already got what you wanted. I'm the one sitting in a cell." Jordan didn't flinch. "I'm not here to rub anything in. I'm here because you need to understand why you're in this cell and how you got here." Troy stood up, his movements jerky, the frustration he had been bottling up starting to leak out. "I know exactly why I'm here. You set me up. You knew you could twist things because you're a cop." Jordan's expression remained calm, though his voice hardened slightly. "Set you up? You think I needed to set you up? You're here because of your own actions." Troy scoffed, shaking his head. "Actions? I was the one who got hit. You shoved me, and now I'm sitting here while you walk free." Jordan stepped closer, his voice low but commanding. "I didn't shove you, Troy. I swatted your hand away when you put your hands on me. Twice. And when you called the police, you thought they'd come down and arrest me just because you said so." Troy's jaw clenched, and he turned away, staring at the wall. "You don't know anything about me. You think you've got it all figured out because you wear a badge." "I don't need to know anything about you," Jordan replied, his tone firm but not aggressive. "What I know is that you assumed calling the police would give you control. You thought you could manipulate the situation, turn yourself into the victim, and that I'd be the one sitting in this cell." Troy turned back, his face flushed with frustration. "You're wrong. I didn't manipulate anything. I was defending myself." Jordan's gaze didn't waver. "Defending yourself from what, Troy? A situation you created? You put your hands on me first. You escalated it, and when things didn't go your way, you tried to use the system to get what you wanted." Troy stepped closer to the bars, his face hardening again. "You're twisting everything. You don't know what it's like. People like you get special treatment all the time. I'm just trying to live my life, and I get treated like I'm the problem." Jordan's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped lower, carrying the weight of years of experience. "Special treatment? You think I get special treatment because I'm a cop? Let me tell you something. You called the police because you thought the law was automatically on your side. You thought your word would be enough to put me in cuffs. That's the special treatment you're used to." Troy opened his mouth to protest, but Jordan didn't let him speak. "You thought you could use the system to protect yourself from the consequences of your own actions," Jordan continued, his voice measured. "But that's not how it works, Troy. Not today." Troy's shoulders slumped, his defiance waning. His eyes darted to the floor, then back up to Jordan. His voice was quieter now, almost pleading. "What do you want from me? You've already got me locked up." Jordan studied him for a moment, letting the silence hang between them before speaking again. I'm not here because I want something from you. I'm here because I want you to understand that what you did, calling the police, trying to play the victim, could have ended very differently for someone else. Troy's brow furrowed. What do you mean? You're lucky, Troy, Jordan said, his tone softening just a fraction. Lucky because this time, you ran into someone who knew how to handle it. But what if it had been someone else? What if you'd called the police on another black man who didn't have my experience, my position? What do you think would have happened then? Troy blinked, confusion crossing his face. I didn't think. That's the point, Jordan interrupted, his voice sharp again. You didn't think. You assumed you could control the situation because you thought you had the upper hand. But what if that wasn't the case? What if the police had come in with a different mindset, believing every word you said? Do you know how many times situations like this go wrong because of someone's assumptions? Troy didn't respond immediately. He stared at Jordan, clearly grappling with the weight of his words. You're sitting in a cell now because of your own actions, Jordan continued. You escalated this. But I need you to understand that it could have gone much worse for someone else. You can't just play the victim when things don't go your way and expect the system to back you up. Troy's face tightened, his voice quieter. I didn't mean for it to get this far. Jordan sighed, shaking his head. That's the problem, Troy. You didn't mean for it to get this far, but you acted like it couldn't. You assumed you'd be fine no matter what happened. But actions have consequences, and you're feeling them now. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Troy stared at the floor, his mind clearly working through everything Jordan had said. Finally, Jordan took a step back. Think about that while you're in here, and maybe next time, you'll realize that you can't just use the system to protect yourself from your own choices. Without another word, Jordan turned and walked away, leaving Troy standing at the bars, his expression a mix of anger, confusion, and something else. Something closer to understanding. As Jordan left the holding area, he felt the tension lift. He had said what needed to be said. Now, it was up to Troy to figure out the rest. Jordan walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing as he made his way back toward the front of the precinct. His conversation with Troy still echoed in his mind. He had delivered the message, but whether Troy took it to heart was beyond his control. That wasn't what mattered right now. As he approached the front desk, he spotted Officer Cruz and Officer Davis going over paperwork. They glanced up when they saw Jordan approaching, both standing a little straighter. Captain, Cruz greeted him, curiosity laced with respect in his tone. How'd it go in there? Jordan nodded. About as expected. Troy's got a lot to think about. Cruz raised an eyebrow, clearly not surprised. Didn't seem too reflective when we brought him in. He was yelling the whole way, blaming everyone but himself. Jordan gave a small shrug. People like him usually do. What's the status on his charges? Cruz flipped through the paperwork in front of him, landing on Troy's file. We've booked him for disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and simple assault. He'll spend the night in the holding cell and see a judge in the morning. He's facing some decent fines, maybe community service, possibly even a short stint in jail depending on the judge. Jordan nodded, his thoughts briefly shifting to how Troy had tried to use the police as a tool for his own advantage. And the assault charge, that's from him putting his hands on me? Cruz nodded. Yep, for when he jammed his finger into your chest, twice. That's what escalated everything. Jordan folded his arms, reflecting on the situation. He thought calling the police would solve the problem in his favor. He didn't expect to be the one sitting in a cell. Officer Davis, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, still looking slightly rattled from the earlier events. Captain, I've never seen someone so sure of himself crash so hard. He really thought he had you when he made that call. Jordan turned to Davis, giving him a small approving nod. That's because people like him believe the system will always back them up. He assumed the law was on his side just because he was the first to call. Davis nodded, absorbing the lesson. He didn't realize who he was dealing with. Jordan shook his head. It's not about who I am, it's about how he sees the world. Troy thought he could use the system to his advantage, that the police would side with him no matter what. It's that entitlement that puts people in dangerous situations. Cruz leaned back against the desk, crossing his arms. Well, he's in for a rude awakening. He'll be facing some serious consequences now. Not just a slap on the wrist. Jordan took a deep breath, processing everything. He had handled the situation calmly, made sure justice was served, and ensured Troy wouldn't walk away thinking he could manipulate the system whenever he wanted. It was moments like this that reminded him why his position mattered. He wasn't just a cop. He was a black police captain in a city where men like Troy often thought they could control the narrative. Jordan had worked his way up through the ranks, knowing that his presence and leadership could change lives, not just in situations like today, but for other black men and women who came through the precinct. He had the power to influence how his officers treated people, to ensure they didn't jump to conclusions based on someone's skin color. Being in a position of authority as a black man gave him the opportunity to confront not just individual incidents of racism, but the larger systemic issues affecting his community. Troy had expected Jordan to be just another black man he could manipulate. But Jordan wasn't about to let that happen. Not today, not ever. It was a reminder that his role wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about protecting his community, changing perceptions, and ensuring that people who came through his precinct, whether officers or civilians, were treated fairly. Davis broke the silence, glancing between Jordan and Cruz. So what happens now? Jordan shrugged, his voice even. The court will handle it. He's going to have to face what he's done. But the bigger lesson for him is realizing that the system he thought would protect him doesn't work like that anymore. Cruz nodded, a small smile on his face. He's going to have a lot of time to think about that. Davis looked at Jordan with admiration in his eyes. You handled that whole thing like it was nothing. I'm not sure I would have been able to stay that calm. Jordan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. You did fine, Davis. You stayed calm, assessed the situation, and didn't jump to conclusions. That's what matters. Davis smiled nervously. Thanks, Captain. I'll try to keep that in mind next time. Jordan gave him a nod, appreciating the rookie's effort. Good. Keep your head clear and always evaluate before you react. Cruz set the paperwork down and folded his arms. Captain, it's good to have someone like you in charge. Honestly, I don't know how that situation would have gone if it were someone else out there. Jordan let the words settle for a moment. He knew Cruz was right. Being in this position mattered. It wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about making sure people like Troy didn't think they could manipulate the system to their advantage. It was about ensuring that black men and women who crossed paths with the police would be treated fairly, with dignity and respect. Thanks, Cruz, Jordan said quietly. But it's not just about me. It's about making sure everyone in this precinct knows that the rules apply equally to everyone, no matter who makes the call. Cruz smiled, but his tone was serious. You're making a difference here, Captain. We all see it. Jordan nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was getting late, and the weight of the day was beginning to settle on his shoulders. It was time to head home, but the significance of the day lingered with him. Today had been a reminder of why he worked so hard to get where he was and why he needed to keep pushing for change. Keep me updated on Troy's case, Jordan said finally, turning to leave, and make sure he gets processed by the book. Cruz gave a quick nod. Will do, Captain? As Jordan walked out of the precinct, the cool night air hit his face, and for the first time in hours, he felt some of the tension release from his body. Troy would face the consequences of his actions. And Jordan knew, at least today, he had played a part in ensuring the system worked the way it was supposed to. He wasn't just proud of being a police captain. He was proud to be a black police captain, a role that gave him the opportunity to make sure men like Troy couldn't misuse the system and to protect those in his community who needed it most. And that, Jordan knew, was the real victory today. It had been a few weeks since the incident, and Jordan found himself in the courtroom, sitting quietly in the back row, waiting for the case of Troy Walters to be called. The room buzzed with hushed voices, lawyers exchanging paperwork, and a few spectators watching the proceedings. Jordan had testified in court many times before, but this time felt different. He wasn't just here as a witness to a crime. He was here to make sure the system worked, that Troy faced the consequences of his actions. When Troy's name was finally called, Jordan stood, making his way to the witness stand. He glanced at Troy as he walked past. Troy sat at the defendant's table, his once arrogant demeanor replaced with tension. The cockiness that had radiated from him during the initial confrontation had long since evaporated. He was no longer in control, and it showed. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, peered over her glasses as she addressed the courtroom. "Mr. Walters, you are facing charges of disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and simple assault. How do you plead?" Troy's lawyer leaned in to whisper something to him, and Troy hesitated before responding. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Jordan felt a slight twinge of frustration but remained calm. He understood that the trial had to take its course and that Troy's guilt would be decided by the facts. Jordan took his seat at the witness stand, waiting for the questioning to begin. The prosecutor stood, a tall man with an air of authority. "Captain Cole, could you please describe the events that took place on the day in question?" Jordan nodded and spoke clearly, recounting the confrontation outside the store. He described how Troy had physically confronted him, escalated the situation, and then tried to manipulate the narrative by calling the police and falsely claiming to be the victim. Troy Walters thought he could use the police to turn the situation in his favor. Jordan explained steadily. "He put his hands on me, and when I defended myself by swatting his hand away, he exaggerated the incident and called the police. When the officers arrived, he expected me to be arrested, simply because he was the one who made the call." The prosecutor nodded. "And as a result of his actions, what charges were brought against Mr. Walters?" "He was arrested for disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and simple assault, stemming from him jabbing his finger into my chest twice and refusing to cooperate with the officers," Jordan responded. The prosecutor turned toward the jury, his voice firm. "Captain Cole, in your professional opinion, was Mr. Walters attempting to manipulate the situation by falsely claiming he had been assaulted?" "Yes," Jordan replied without hesitation. "He believed that calling the police would put him in control. When that didn't happen, he escalated things even further." The defense attorney, a sharply dressed man, stood and approached Jordan with a skeptical look. "Captain Cole, is it possible that Mr. Walters felt threatened by your actions and was merely trying to defend himself?" Jordan didn't flinch. "No, he was the one who initiated physical contact. When I defended myself, he chose to overreact. He wasn't defending himself, he was trying to provoke me into a situation where he thought he could use the system against me." The defense attorney pressed on. "But couldn't it be said that, as a police captain, you had the authority and experience to de-escalate the situation?" Jordan's gaze didn't waver. "I did de-escalate the situation. I didn't retaliate physically after he put his hands on me. I stayed calm, and the police handled the rest." The defense attorney gave a slight nod, seeing that this line of questioning was not going to sway the court, and sat back down. The prosecutor resumed his questioning. "No further questions, Your Honor." Jordan stepped down from the witness stand and took his seat again, briefly locking eyes with Troy. Troy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly realizing that his defense was crumbling. As the courtroom proceedings continued, it became increasingly obvious that Troy had little defense. The testimony from Jordan and the officers who had arrived on the scene painted a clear picture. Troy had tried to manipulate the law for his own benefit, but had ended up on the wrong side of it. After reviewing the evidence, the judge gave a firm nod. "I have reviewed the testimony and the charges against Mr. Walters. It is clear that Mr. Walters' actions were not only reckless, but also an attempt to manipulate the police for his own advantage. This court finds Mr. Walters guilty of disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and simple assault." Troy's face turned pale. His lawyer's attempts to downplay the charges had clearly failed. The judge continued. "Mr. Walters, you are hereby sentenced to pay a fine for each of the charges. You will also serve 60 days of community service, attend anger management counseling, and, should there be any further incidents, this court will not hesitate to impose harsher penalties." Troy opened his mouth in protest, but his lawyer placed a hand on his arm, urging him to stay quiet. It was clear that there was no room left for argument. Jordan felt a sense of closure as the judge brought down the gavel. Troy would have to face the consequences of his actions. Though the sentence wasn't long, the message was clear. The system could not always be bent to his will. As the courtroom cleared, Jordan stood by the doors, watching Troy shuffle out, his arrogance completely stripped away. For a moment, their eyes met again. Troy quickly looked away, his shoulders slumping as he was escorted out. Cruz, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom, walked up beside Jordan, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Looks like justice was served," Cruz said. Jordan nodded slowly. "Yeah, it was." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Jordan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just because Troy had been held accountable, but because he, as a black police captain, had been in a position to ensure justice was done. His role allowed him to protect others in his community, making sure that situations like this weren't swept under the rug. It was moments like this that reminded him why he worked so hard to rise through the ranks. He wanted to be in the room when decisions like these were made, ensuring that men like Troy couldn't weaponize the system against those it was supposed to protect. Justice had been served, and for Jordan, that was what mattered most. A few months had passed since Troy's sentencing, and life at the precinct had returned to its usual rhythm. Jordan continued managing his team, addressing day-to-day issues, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Still, the memory of his encounter with Troy Walters remained fresh in his mind. Jordan had moved past it, but every now and then, he thought about Troy's smug face and his assumption that he could manipulate the system. One afternoon, Officer Cruz knocked on Jordan's office door before stepping in. Jordan looked up from his paperwork and nodded for him to enter. "Captain, you got a minute?" Cruz asked, his tone careful, suggesting something out of the ordinary. "Sure, what's up?" Jordan replied, leaning back in his chair. Cruz sat down across from him, his expression a mix of hesitation and curiosity. "I just heard something about Troy Walters, the guy we arrested a few months back. You remember him?" Jordan's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Troy's name. He hadn't forgotten. Troy's entitled attitude and the racist remarks he had made in the store were seared into his memory. "Yeah, I remember. What about him?" Cruz leaned forward. "Word is, after the charges stuck, he lost his job. His company didn't want the bad press, especially after everything that came out in court. Since then, he's been having a rough time. No steady work, struggling to get back on his feet." Jordan sat in silence for a moment, taking it in. He wasn't surprised. Troy had lived his life assuming he could say and do whatever he wanted without facing consequences. Now reality had hit him, and it had hit him hard. "I figured something like that might happen," Jordan finally said, his voice calm. Cruz nodded slowly, his eyes scanning Jordan's face. "Some of the guys were wondering if, I don't know, if you feel any kind of regret. I mean, the guy's life is in shambles now. He lost his job and he's struggling. Do you ever wonder if it was too much for just one incident?" Jordan raised an eyebrow at the question, but his response came without hesitation. "Regret? No, Cruz, I don't regret a thing." Cruz looked at Jordan, waiting for him to continue. Jordan leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but firm. "You weren't in the store that day, but let me tell you what kind of man Troy Walters is. He was standing there, blaming black people for the store's extra security measures, saying things like, 'If they didn't steal, we wouldn't have to deal with this.' He was loud, making a scene, making everyone uncomfortable. He thought he could say whatever he wanted and no one would call him out for it." Cruz nodded, his face showing understanding. "I didn't know it went that far." "It did," Jordan said firmly, "and when I stepped in and told him to knock it off, he escalated. He didn't just stop with the comments. He put his hands on me, thinking he could intimidate me. And when I didn't give him the reaction he wanted, he called the police, assuming we'd show up, take his side, and throw me in jail. That's who Troy Walters is, someone who thinks he can manipulate the system to avoid consequences." Cruz listened closely, absorbing the weight of Jordan's words. He wasn't just mouthing off. He genuinely believed that the law would bend in his favor because he was the first to call it in. Jordan continued. "People like Troy think they can say whatever they want, do whatever they want, and blame others when things don't go their way. He expected the system to protect him, even after everything he did. Cruz shifted slightly in his seat. So you don't feel bad that he lost his job? Jordan shook his head. Not at all. People need to face the consequences of their actions. Troy walked through life thinking he could treat people however he wanted, say whatever he wanted, and never be held accountable. Losing his job? That's on him, not me. Cruz nodded, clearly seeing Jordan's point. Yeah, I guess that's true. It's just, some people might see losing his job and struggling as too much for one incident. Jordan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. This wasn't just one incident, Cruz. It was a pattern. Troy's entire mindset is built on the belief that the system works for him, that he can use it to punish others while he walks away unscathed. And this time, it didn't work out for him. That's not my problem. It's his. He needed to learn that actions have consequences. Cruz raised an eyebrow. I get it. I just wanted to hear it from you. I wasn't there in the store, and I guess I didn't realize just how bad it got. Jordan exhaled slowly. He tried to make me the scapegoat, Cruz. He thought his racist remarks would go unchecked. He thought calling the police would make him the victim and me the criminal. And when that didn't happen, his entire worldview fell apart. He needed to face the consequences, and I don't regret helping make sure that happened. Cruz smiled slightly. I get it now. You did the right thing. He needed that wake-up call. Jordan gave a small nod, his voice quiet but resolute. People like Troy need consequences. It's not about punishing them for the sake of it. It's about accountability. He spent his life blaming others, and now, for once, he's the one who has to take responsibility. I don't feel sorry for him. Cruz stood up, clearly satisfied with Jordan's response. Thanks for clearing that up, Captain. I just wanted to make sure I understood the whole picture. Jordan smiled briefly. You did good bringing him in, Cruz. The system worked this time, and that's what matters. As Cruz left, Jordan sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. The truth was, being a black police captain gave him a unique opportunity to ensure that people like Troy didn't walk away from situations like this without understanding the weight of their actions. He had fought hard to get where he was, and part of his job was making sure the system couldn't be used as a weapon against those it was supposed to protect. Jordan wasn't just in a position of authority, he was in a position to enforce fairness and accountability. Troy had learned a hard lesson, and while it might have cost him his job, it wasn't something Jordan regretted. Troy had made those racist remarks in the store because he thought no one would hold him accountable. Now, he knew better. Jordan looked out the window, watching the city move with its usual energy. He didn't regret a thing. People needed consequences, and Troy Walters had learned that the hard way. For Jordan, that was more than enough.